The moment my son-in-law changed the locks, I was still standing in the driveway with my coat in my hands. I'd come back from my sister's place in Flagstaff 3 days early, and the key just didn't turn. I stood there jiggling it like an idiot, like maybe I was the one who'd gotten it wrong, and then the porch light came on, and there was Grant, filling up the doorway in his undershirt, looking at me like I was a salesman he didn't have time for. "This isn't really a good time, Beverly," he said. "Not Mom." Beverly. Behind him I could hear my daughter's voice, soft and far off, asking who it was. He didn't answer her. He just stood there with his hand braced on the doorframe, and over his shoulder I could see my own living room. My reading chair, my mother's mantel clock, the rug I'd hauled back from a trip to Santa Fe 20 years ago, and none of it felt like mine anymore. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it took me a long time to understand how a person ends up locked out of her own front porch. So let me back up and let me ask you something while I do. If it were you standing there in the cold, suitcase handle digging into your palm, your own child's husband telling you it isn't a good time, what would you do? Hold on to that question. I'll come back to it. My name is Beverly Calhoun. I'm 66 years old, and for most of my life I thought I understood exactly who my family was. I grew up outside Tulsa, the youngest of 4, raised by a mother who ironed pillowcases and a father who fixed combines for a living and didn't believe in raising his voice, not once, not even the time I backed the truck into the propane tank. I met my husband Wendell at a county fair when I was 19. He was selling raffle tickets for the volunteer fire department, and he had a gap between his front teeth that I found myself thinking about for 2 weeks straight before I let him take me to a diner. We married the next spring. Wendell wasn't a man who talked much, but he was the kind of man who showed up. 31 years he drove a delivery route for a regional grocery distributor, up before dawn, home by 4, and not once in those 31 years did I hear him complain about it. I worked too, first as a receptionist at a dental office, then, once I'd taken some night classes, as an office manager for a small accounting firm downtown. Between the two of us we never had much extra, but we had enough, and what we had we built ourselves, brick by brick, the way people did back then. We had one daughter, Renee. From the day she was born, Wendell looked at that girl like she'd hung the moon. He taught her to ride a bike in the church parking lot, taught her to bait a hook, even though she screamed the first 3 times, sat through every single piano recital, even the ones where she forgot the second half of the piece and just made something up. I used to tease him that he loved her more than he loved me, and he'd just smile that gap-toothed smile and say, "Different kind of love, Bev. Don't compete with it." Rennie grew up smart and a little restless, the kind of girl who always had one foot out the door even as a teenager, like she could feel a bigger life waiting for her somewhere else. She went to college on a partial scholarship and student loans we helped cover, studied marketing, and met Grant Pearson her senior year at a job fair, of all places. He was sharp, good-looking, had a confident handshake and a way of talking about his 5-year plan that impressed Wendell more than it impressed me, if I'm honest. But I kept that to myself. You learn, as a mother, when to keep things to yourself. They married 8 years ago in a backyard ceremony that Wendell and I paid for almost entirely because Grant's family, as it turned out, didn't have much to offer beyond good wishes and a fruit basket. I didn't mind. That's what parents do. 3 years ago, Wendell passed, his heart sudden on a Tuesday morning while he was tying his work boots. I won't dwell on that. I could fill 100 hours talking about that morning, and it still wouldn't be enough, and it still wouldn't be the point of this story. But I need you to understand that after 34 years of marriage, I was, overnight, profoundly alone in a house built for 2 people who finished each other's sentences. That's when Renee and Grant first brought up moving in. It made sense, on paper. The house Wendell and I owned outright was a modest 4-bedroom in a quiet part of town, paid off years ago, sitting mostly empty except for me rattling around in it. Renee and Grant were renting a cramped 2-bedroom across town with a baby on the way. My grandson, Theodore, born that same winter, and money, Grant said, was tight but temporary. He had a habit of saying things were temporary. "You wouldn't even have to do anything, Mom," Renee told me over the phone, her voice doing that careful thing it did when she wanted something. "We'd just be there, keep you company, help with the yard, the bills, all of it." I said yes before she even finished the sentence. I was lonely in a way I didn't have words for yet, and the idea of a baby's laughter in that house again, it felt like something to hold on to. They moved in that spring, and for the first year, I'll admit, it was good. Theodore took his first steps in my kitchen, holding onto the handle of the oven door. Renee and I cooked together on Sundays the way we used to when she was a teenager, the two of us elbow to elbow at the counter while Grant watched football in the next room. I told myself this was what Wendell would have wanted. The house full again, the silence broken. But you know how these things go. Or maybe you don't yet, and I'm sorry if you have to learn it the way I did. It started small. Grant began referring to which bills were his and Renee's, and which expenses were household, in a way that always seemed to put more on my side of the ledger than his. He'd mention, almost offhand, that the property taxes were getting up there for someone living alone in a house this size, as if I were a tenant he was doing a favor for. Renee, caught in the middle, started going quiet at dinner, looking down at her plate when Grant made those comments instead of looking at me. Then came the kitchen renovation. Grant decided, without much discussion, that the kitchen needed updating. New cabinets, a different layout, an island where my breakfast nook used to be, the one where Wendell used to read the paper every single morning of his life. I said I wasn't sure I wanted to spend that kind of money on something I was perfectly happy with. Grant said, very reasonably, that it would raise the value of the home. Like the home's value was a shared project between us and not something that already, fully belonged to me. I paid for most of it. $11,000. I told myself it was an investment in family harmony. It wasn't. 6 months after the renovation, things shifted again. The way water finds a crack and just keeps widening it. Grant started talking about the garage, how it could be converted into a mother-in-law suite, he called it, like it was something generous he was offering me, instead of what it actually was. A smaller space, further from the rest of the house, further from my grandson's bedroom, further from the life I'd built room by room for over 3 decades. "It would give you more privacy, Mom," Renee said, not quite meeting my eyes, the same way Grant didn't quite meet mine when he talked about money. I told her I didn't want more privacy. I wanted my house. That conversation ended badly. Grant said I was being difficult and ungrateful for everything they'd sacrificed. To be there for me, which struck me as an interesting use of the word sacrifice, considering they hadn't paid a dime of rent in 2 years, and the mortgage had been paid off long before either of them ever set foot in that house. I should have said something then. I should have drawn a line right there at that kitchen table with the new cabinets I'd paid for. But I didn't, because Theodore was 4 years old by then and called me Gam Gam and ran to me every morning before he ran to anyone else, and I was terrified that drawing a line meant losing that too. So I stayed quiet. I let it go. I told myself it was just a rough patch, the kind every family has. I want to tell you what I didn't know, sitting at that table swallowing my own anger like a pill that wouldn't go down. 22 years earlier, before I'd even married Wendell, my father had quietly bought a small parcel of land outside of Tulsa. Scrubby, unremarkable acreage nobody wanted, the kind of land you buy because it's cheap and you're hoping someday somebody finds something useful underneath it. He'd put my name on it as a young woman, mostly as a tax arrangement his accountant suggested, and then promptly forgot about it for the rest of his life, the way men of his generation forgot about a great many practical things they'd quietly handled. I forgot about it too. It was just a line item I half remembered on some property tax document I filed away every December without reading closely. 3 weeks before that night on the porch, I got a call from a land management attorney I'd never spoken to in my life. A natural gas company had been quietly leasing mineral rights across that stretch of county for the better part of a decade, and a recent well on adjacent land had come in big enough that they were now scrambling to lock down every parcel nearby before word got out and prices climbed. My little forgotten acreage sat directly over a productive section of the formation. The number the attorney gave me on that first call made me sit down on the kitchen floor, right there with the phone against my ear, because my legs simply stopped agreeing to hold me up. I didn't tell Renee. I didn't tell Grant. I'm not entirely sure why, except that some old animal instinct in me, something that had been quietly taking notes for 2 years at that dinner table, told me to wait, to understand what I actually had before I said a word about it to anyone. So I met with the attorney twice more, in his office with the door closed, and I learned the actual shape of what was happening to my life. A signing bonus alone, before a single drop came out of the ground, north of $2 million. Royalties on top of that, for years, possibly decades. I was still turning all of this over quietly in my mind, still hadn't said a single word to anyone, when I made the mistake of going to visit my sister Joelle in Flagstaff for what was supposed to be a relaxing week. I came home 3 days early because Theodore had a school event I didn't want to miss. Which brings us back to that porch. Grant's hand on the doorframe. "Beverly, not Mom. We've been talking," he said, like that explained anything, like 2 years of comments about property taxes and mother-in-law suites hadn't already told me everything I needed to know about what talking meant in that house. "Renee and I think it's time you looked at some independent living options, somewhere more your speed, my speed." I was 66 years old, not 90, and I'd been climbing onto the roof to clean the gutters myself the previous October. "This is my house, Grant," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. "Actually," he said, and here's the part that still makes my hands go cold when I think about it, "we've spoken to someone about guardianship. Given some of the decisions you've been making lately, refusing reasonable updates to the home, this sudden trip you didn't tell anyone about. Renee's a little worried, Beverly. We both are." I understood standing there that this wasn't a misunderstanding I could clear up with a calm conversation. This was a plan. They had spoken to a lawyer. They had used the word guardianship, a word that, once spoken out loud in a driveway by your own son-in-law, changes the temperature of the whole rest of your life. "Where's Theodore?" I asked, because in that moment, stupidly, that was the only thing I could think to ask. "He's fine. He's having a snack." Grant said it like I'd asked something irrelevant. Renee finally came to the door then, and I will never forget her face. Not angry, not even particularly firm, just tired, the way a person looks when they've already decided something and are simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "Mom, we just think it would be good for you to have some support. You've seemed different since Dad. As if grief were the diagnosis and a smaller, lonelier life was the prescribed treatment. I didn't argue with them on that porch. I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer in telling you this. I didn't argue because I was afraid that if I pushed too hard, I would lose my grandson entirely, and some part of me, in that moment, was still operating from the same fear that had kept me quiet at that kitchen table 2 years earlier. I asked quietly if I could come in and get a few things for the night. Grant said it wasn't the best time, but that I could arrange something through Renee for my belongings later. I checked into a Best Western off the interstate that night with 2 suitcases and a coat I never got the chance to put on, and I sat on the end of that stiff hotel bed, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since the morning I found Wendell on the bedroom floor with his boots half tied. But somewhere around 2 in the morning, something in me went very, very still and very, very clear. I am not a vindictive woman. I want you to understand that going forward, because what happened next wasn't revenge, not really, even though I understand if it looks that way from the outside. It was simply the truth, finally allowed to stand up straight. The next morning, I called the attorney back. Not the gas lease attorney, a different one. An estate and elder law attorney named Diane Castellano, a woman with a steady voice and absolutely no patience for what she called, once I'd told her the whole story, a classic and frankly clumsy attempt at financial elder abuse. She explained it to me plainly. The house, every brick of it, was solely in my name. Wendell and I had never added Renee, not out of any lack of love, But because Wendell's own mother had been pressured out of her home in her 70s by a son-in-law not unlike Grant, and he'd sworn, after watching that happen, that it would never happen to me. The kitchen renovation I'd paid for had no legal bearing on ownership whatsoever. And the word guardianship Grant had used so casually in that driveway was, Diane informed me, a legal process that requires actual medical and psychiatric evaluation, not a son-in-law's irritation that his mother-in-law wouldn't hand over a garage. They can't take your home, Beverly, she said. Not unless a court finds you incompetent to manage your own affairs, and I promise you, nothing in what you've told me suggests that's remotely possible. Then I told her about the mineral rights. There was a long pause on the line, and then she said, very calmly, I think we need to talk about how you want to handle this, because right now you are holding considerably more power in this situation than they understand. Within a week, the gas company's signing cleared, and $2.3 million landed in an account Diane helped me set up, with the royalty structure still being finalized behind it. A structure that, her associate later estimated conservatively, could bring in another $6 to $8 million over the life of the well, possibly more if a second well on the adjoining section, currently under negotiation, came through. I did not go back to that house and announce it triumphantly on the porch, the way I imagine some version of this story might go if it were trying to be satisfying instead of true. What I did was quieter and in its own way harder. I had Diane send a formal letter to Renee and Grant on firm letterhead, stating plainly that I retained full legal ownership of the property, that I would be returning to collect my personal belongings on a specific date with a locksmith and, if necessary, a sheriff's deputy present, and that any further reference to guardianship proceedings against me would be met with my own attorney's full and immediate response, including, she noted, a formal report to Oklahoma's Adult Protective Services regarding what had occurred. Grant called 11 times that first day. I didn't answer once. Renee texted, then called, then texted again, longer messages each time, the tone shifting from defensive to confused to, by the fourth message, something that read almost like fear. Mom, what is going on? Please just call me back. Theodore is asking for you. That last part nearly broke me. I sat in that Best Western room with my thumb hovering over her name for the better part of an hour. But Diane had told me something I needed to hear, and I'm going to pass it along to you now, because I think some of you listening need to hear it too. Love for your grandchild is not the same thing as an obligation to accept your own erasure. You can love a 4-year-old boy with your whole chest and still refuse to disappear quietly into a garage for the comfort of the adults around him. I changed the locks myself, with a locksmith and, yes, a deputy standing politely on the lawn, exactly 9 days after Grant told me it wasn't the best time for me to come home. I walked through my own front door into my own living room, past my mother's mantel clock, which someone, Grant, I assume, had moved to a side table to make room for a flat-screen television I hadn't approved and certainly hadn't paid for, and I felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in 2 years. Renee was there. I'd had Diane inform them of the date and time in advance, deliberately, because despite everything, I did not want to ambush my own daughter in front of her son. She was sitting on the porch steps when I arrived, not inside, like she somehow already understood she no longer had the standing to be inside waiting for me. She looked smaller than I remembered her looking, even just 9 days earlier. "Mom!" she said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable. "Is it true? About the land?" I told her it was true. I told her the number, because I decided somewhere in that hotel room that I was done managing what other people could and couldn't handle hearing from me. I watched her face do something complicated, relief, then something that looked almost like shame, then something I recognized uncomfortably as the same calculation I'd watched Grant make at that dinner table over the kitchen renovation. "Grant wants to talk to you," she said. "He says there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't been," I said. I understood perfectly. I just didn't say anything out loud until now. I want to tell you that I cut them off completely, that I delivered some perfect, devastating speech on that porch, and drove off into a new life without looking back because I know that's the ending some of you are hoping for, based on the messages I get after stories like this. But real life is messier than that, and I promised you the truth. What actually happened is this. I let Renee back into my life, slowly, on terms I set and did not negotiate. Grant, I did not. I told her plainly that I would always be her mother and Theodore's grandmother, and that door would never close, but that her husband was no longer welcome in my home. Not for holidays, not for Sunday dinners, not for anything, and that this was not a punishment I expected her to fix, but a boundary I expected her to respect if she wanted to remain close to me. It cost something. Renee struggled with it for months, caught between a husband unwilling to apologize for something he still, as far as I know, doesn't fully believe he did wrong, and a mother who had finally, at 66 years old, stopped being willing to disappear for anyone's comfort. There were stretches of silence between us that lasted weeks. There were nights I sat in my own quiet living room, in my own reading chair, and wondered if I'd traded one kind of loneliness for another. But Theodore still comes over most Saturdays. We bake together now the way Renee and I used to. Last month he asked me, completely out of nowhere, why Grandpa Wendell's reading nook in the kitchen went away and then came back, because I'd had the original breakfast nook restored, cabinets and all, the exact dimensions, the exact spot where Wendell used to sit every morning with his coffee and his newspaper. I told Theodore that sometimes grown-ups make changes they later realize they shouldn't have made, and that it's never too late to put things back the way they belonged. I think about that driveway sometimes, the cold coming through my coat that I never got the chance to put on, Grant's hand braced on the doorframe like he owned something he'd never once paid for, the word guardianship, hanging in the air like it could just rearrange the facts of whose name was on whose deed. I think about how close I came to staying quiet permanently, the way I'd stayed quiet about the kitchen, about the garage, about every small surrender that came before the big one almost did. So here's what I'd ask you. The same question I asked you at the start, except now I want you to really answer it. If your own family stood in the doorway of the life you built and told you it wasn't your turn to be inside it anymore, would you go quietly or would you, finally, stand up straight? I went quietly for 2 years. I am not going quietly anymore. And if there's one thing I hope you carry out of this story with you, it's this. The house was always mine. It was mine long before anyone tried to convince me otherwise, and it is mine still, and some truths don't need anyone else's permission to finally be spoken out loud.